In the sleepy town of Maplewood, Illinois, where the cornfields stretched endless and the winters bit hard, there was an old brick apartment building called Elmwood Heights. It wasn't much. 3 stories of chipped paint, creaky stairs, and tenants who minded their own business. But for the past 6 months, something had stirred the quiet. A sound. A low, mournful meow that drifted up from the basement, cutting through the hum of radiators and the chatter of TV screens. It wasn't just any meow. It was a cry, a plea, like someone calling out a name they'd forgotten. The tenants had nicknamed him Basement Buddy. No one knew where the scrawny tabby cat had come from. He'd just appeared one day, slinking out from the shadows of the basement stairwell, his green eyes wide and searching. They fed him scraps, tuna from Mrs. Carter on the 2nd floor, bits of chicken from old Mr. Hensley, but no one dared take him in. Too wild, they said. Too sad. And that meowing? Every night, without fail, it echoed up the vents, a sound that made your chest ache if you listened too long. Dr. Emily Harper, the town's only veterinarian, heard about Basement Buddy from Mrs. Carter during a checkup for her overweight tabby Muffin. "He's down there again, Doc," the old woman said, wringing her hands. "Meowing like he's lost his whole world. I'd take him myself, but Muffin'd claw my eyes out." Emily nodded, half listening. She'd seen her share of strays. Maplewood wasn't kind to abandoned pets. But something in Mrs. Carter's voice stuck with her. That night, curiosity got the better of her. The basement of Elmwood Heights was a dungeon of damp concrete and flickering fluorescence. Emily descended the stairs, her boots echoing, a flashlight in one hand and a bag of treats in the other. The air smelled of mildew and rust. Then she heard it. Soft at first, then louder, a meow that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "Hey, buddy," she called, her voice steady but gentle. "Where you at?" The sound stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy. She found him curled in a corner, behind a stack of moldy boxes. A skinny thing, all bones and matted fur, his eyes glinting like twin moons in the dark. Emily crouched, holding out a treat. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you checked out." He didn't move, just stared, his meow starting again. Low, insistent, almost human. She frowned. Something was off. This wasn't hunger or pain. This was something else. As she coaxed him closer, her flashlight caught a glint under his chin. A collar? No, a thin chain, tangled in his fur, with a small, flat pendant dangling from it. Emily's pulse quickened. She reached out, careful not to spook him, and slid the chain free. The pendant wasn't a tag. It was a locket, scratched and tarnished. She clicked it open. Inside was a tiny photo, a blurry shot of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. Emily's breath hitched. Who was this? And why was this cat carrying it? Back in her clinic the next morning, Emily cleaned him up. Fleas, malnourishment, but no microchip. She named him Shadow for the way he'd lurked in the dark. All day he sat on her exam table, meowing that same haunting sound, his eyes fixed on her like he was waiting for something. By noon, she couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't just a stray. This cat knew something big. She glanced at the locket again, the girl's face staring back. "Who are you, Shadow?" she murmured. "And who's she?" The fluorescent lights of Harper Veterinary Clinic buzzed overhead as Emily sat at her desk, Shadow perched beside her. His meowing had quieted to a soft, rhythmic purr, but those green eyes still bore into her, unblinking. The locket lay open on the table, the little girl's photo yellowed at the edges. Emily couldn't stop staring at it. Maplewood was small, barely 3,000 people, and she'd lived here her whole life, She didn't recognize the child, but something about the image tugged at a memory she couldn't place. She snapped a picture of the photo with her phone and sent it to Jake Hensley, the maintenance guy at Elmwood Heights and grandson of old Mr. Hensley. Jake knew everyone's business. Part gossip, part handyman. "Hey, Jake," she texted. "Ever seen this kid? Found it on a cat in your basement?" Her phone pinged back almost instantly. "Nope, doesn't ring a bell. Creepy, though. Where'd basement buddy get that?" Emily frowned. Good question. By afternoon, she'd called the county shelter, the police station, even the local historical society. No missing kids matched the description, no reports of a lost cat with a locket. Shadow's meow started up again, louder now, like he was scolding her for stalling. All right, she muttered, grabbing her keys. "Let's go back where you came from." Elmwood Heights loomed against the gray March sky, the wind whistling through its cracked windows. Emily parked her truck and carried Shadow inside, his frail body trembling in her arms. The basement door creaked as she pushed it open, the same damp chill greeting her. She set him down, watching as he bolted straight to that corner behind the boxes. He pawed at the floor, meowing. Sharp, desperate cries now. "What is it, bud?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Her flashlight swept the concrete. Nothing but dust and cobwebs. Then Shadow's claw snagged something, a loose edge. She brushed the dirt away, revealing a small metal hatch, rusted shut. Her heart thudded. With a grunt, she pried it open using a screwdriver from her bag. Inside was a shallow compartment, barely a foot deep. And there, nestled in the dark, was a child's shoe. Pink, scuffed, with a faded bunny sticker on the sole. Emily's stomach dropped. She looked at Shadow. He'd stopped meowing, just sat there, staring at the shoe like it was an old friend. Back at the clinic, she laid the shoe next to the locket. The girl's smile, the bunny sticker. It clicked. Not a coincidence. She called Sheriff Dan Torres, a gruff man who'd known her since she was a kid, pulling weeds for pocket money. "Dan, I need you to check something," she said, voice tight. "Old missing persons cases. A little girl, dark hair, maybe 5 or 6, from Maplewood, 10, 20 years back." He sighed. You know how many cold cases we got? What's this about?" She hesitated. "A cat, and a shoe." Dan showed up an hour later, a manila folder under his arm. "Found one match," he said, spreading papers across her desk. "Lila Monroe, 6 years old, went missing August 2003. Lived at Elmwood Heights with her mom, Sarah. No leads, case went cold. Mom moved away after—" He tapped a grainy photo, a dark-haired girl with that same gap-toothed grin. Emily's breath caught. It was her. Shadow meowed, low and mournful, like he knew. "Wait," Emily said, scanning the file. "Says here Lila had a cat. Tabby, no name listed." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You think that's him? He'd be ancient." She glanced at Shadow, his fur patchy but his eyes sharp. "Maybe. But how's he still here? And why's he got her picture?" Dan rubbed his jaw. "Beats me, but that shoe? That's evidence now. I'm calling the state police." As Dan stepped outside to make the call, Emily knelt by Shadow. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" she whispered. His purr vibrated against her hand, and for the first time, she felt the weight of his grief, and her own resolve to find out why. The state police arrived the next morning, their black SUVs clogging the narrow street outside Elmwood Heights. Sheriff Dan had cordoned off the basement, and Emily watched from the sidewalk, Shadow cradled in her arms. His meowing had stopped, replaced by a tense silence, his body stiff against her chest. She couldn't shake the image of Lila Monroe's photo, those bright eyes, that bunny sticker. How had a 6-year-old vanished from a town this small And why was Shadow still here, guarding her ghost? Detective Laura Grayson, a wiry woman with a no-nonsense buzz cut, took charge. She grilled Emily about the locket and the shoe, her pen scratching notes on a pad. "So this cat just led you to it?" she asked, skepticism sharp in her voice. Emily nodded. "He knew where to look. I don't know how, but he did." Grayson glanced at Shadow, who stared back with an intensity that made her blink. "All right, we'll sweep the basement. You stay out of the way." Emily retreated to her clinic, but her mind raced. She pulled up old articles on her laptop, Maplewood Gazette archives from 2003. Lila's disappearance had been front-page news for weeks. "Local girl missing," one headline blared. "Mother pleads for answers." Sarah Monroe's tear-streaked face stared from a grainy photo, her hands clutching a stuffed rabbit. No mention of a cat, though. Emily frowned. Shadow wasn't in the story, but he was in the basement. "Why?" Her phone buzzed. Jake Hensley. "Doc, you won't believe this," he said, breathless. "Cops found something down there behind the walls." Emily's pulse spiked. "What?" "A box, metal, locked tight. They're cutting it open now." She grabbed her keys. "I'm coming." Back at Elmwood Heights, the basement buzzed with activity. Floodlights, evidence bags, the whine of a saw. Grayson waved her over. "Your cat's a damn bloodhound," she said, holding up a small steel box, its lid pried off. Inside was a jumble of items. A child's drawing of a cat with "Shadow" scrawled in crayon, a cheap plastic bracelet, and a folded letter, yellowed and brittle. Emily's hands shook as she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, adult. "If you find this, she's gone. I couldn't save her. The cat knows. Don't trust him. No signature." "Him?" Emily muttered. Grayson shrugged. "Could be anyone. We're testing for prints, DNA. But this looks like a confession, or a warning." Emily glanced at Shadow, perched on a crate, his eyes fixed on the box. "Who don't you trust, buddy?" she whispered. That night, she couldn't sleep. Shadow curled beside her on the couch, his purr a low hum. She kept replaying the letter. "The cat knows. Knows what?" She dug deeper online, cross-referencing names from Lila's case. Sarah Monroe had moved to Springfield after the disappearance, remarried, dropped off the grid. But there was another name. Tom Kessler, the Elmwood Heights landlord in 03. He'd been questioned, released, no evidence. Now, dead, heart attack in 09. Emily's gut twisted. Dead ends everywhere. Then her phone rang. Grayson, voice clipped. "We got a hit. Prints on the box match a guy named Eddie Ray. Small-time crook, lived in Maplewood back then. Did time for burglary, got out in 05, vanished." Emily sat up. "Where is he now?" "That's the thing," Grayson said. "No record after 2007. But here's the kicker. Witnesses said he worked maintenance at Elmwood Heights part-time with Kessler." Emily's blood ran cold. Maintenance, access to the basement. She looked at Shadow, his ears twitching. "You saw him, didn't you?" she said softly. The cat's eyes gleamed, and for a moment she swore he nodded. The pieces were falling together, but the picture was still blurry. Who was Eddie Ray? What had he done to Lila? And why had Shadow stayed, meowing for months? Years waiting for someone to listen. The next morning broke cold and gray over Maplewood, a fine mist clinging to the streets. Emily barely slept, her dreams haunted by Lila's gap-toothed smile and Shadow's endless meows. The clinic felt too small, the air too thick. She paced, the steel box's contents spread across her desk, the drawing, the bracelet, the cryptic letter. Don't trust him. Eddie Ray's name burned in her mind, a ghost from 2003, a maintenance man with a rap sheet. She needed answers, and Shadow watching her from his perch, seemed to demand them too. Detective Grayson called at 8. "We tracked Eddie Ray's last known address," she said, voice taut. "Trailer park outside Springfield, abandoned since 2008. State police are searching it today. You sitting tight?" Emily glanced at Shadow, his tail flicking. "Yeah," she lied. She couldn't sit tight, not with Lila's shoe in an evidence bag and Shadow's eyes boring into her soul. She drove an hour to Springfield, Shadow in the passenger seat, his meows soft but urgent. The trailer park was a graveyard of rusting hulks, weeds choking the cracked pavement. Grayson's team was already there, yellow tape flapping in the wind. Emily parked out of sight and slipped closer, Shadow tucked under her jacket. She wasn't supposed to be here, but something, maybe the cat, maybe her gut, pulled her forward. The trailer was a shell, its roof half-caved, windows smashed. Inside, cops bagged scraps, cigarette butts, a stained mattress, a broken watch. Then she heard it. A shout. "Over here." An officer waved from the back, where a trap door gaped in the floor. Grayson emerged holding a plastic bag. Emily squinted. Inside was a child's jacket, pink, faded, with a bunny patch on the sleeve. Her breath stopped. Lila's. Grayson spotted her. "Harper, what the hell? I told you to stay put." Emily ignored her, clutching Shadow tighter. "That's hers, isn't it?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "Looks like it. We're pulling prints. If Eddie Ray was here." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Back home, Emily sat with Shadow, the radio crackling with static. Grayson called again that night. "Prints match Eddie Ray. DNA on the jacket's pending, but it's Lila's size, style. We think he took her, hid her here. No body yet, but..." Emily cut in. "Why'd Shadow stay? Why the locket?" Grayson sighed. "Maybe he saw it. Maybe he's just a damn cat." But he wasn't just a cat. Emily knew it. She grabbed the letter again. "The cat knows." She turned to Shadow. "What did you see, huh? What did he do?" Shadow meowed, a sharp, piercing sound, and bolted to the door, pawing at it. Her heart raced. She followed him outside, into the dark. He led her back to Elmwood Heights, straight to the basement. The police tape was gone, the scene released. Shadow darted to a corner. Not the hatch, but a crack in the wall, barely visible. He clawed at it, meowing louder. Emily grabbed a crowbar from her truck and pried the plaster loose. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside, a rusted toolbox. She opened it, hands shaking. Photos spilled out. Lila smiling, then crying, then still. A man's shadow loomed in the background. Eddie Ray, she'd bet her life on it. And a note, scrawled in the same shaky hand. She screamed. He wouldn't stop. "I hid her here." Emily stumbled back, bile rising. Shadow pressed against her leg, his purr a low rumble. The truth hit like a freight train. Eddie Ray had killed Lila, hid her in the trailer, and someone who knew, had sealed this confession in the wall. But who? Kessler, the landlord? Sarah, her mother? And Shadow? He'd stayed, meowing for decades, guarding the secret until someone listened. She called Grayson, voice trembling. "I found it. Photos, a note. He did it." The detective swore. "Stay there, we're coming." As sirens wailed in the distance, Emily sank to the floor, Shadow in her lap. "You kept her alive," she whispered, "all this time." The basement of Elmwood Heights glowed red and blue as police lights flashed through the grimy windows. Emily sat on the cold concrete, Shadow nestled in her lap, his purr steady now, like a heartbeat. The toolbox lay open beside her, its grim contents, photos, the note, spread out for the world to see. Detective Grayson arrived with her team. their boots echoing as they secured the scene. She knelt beside Emily, her face a mix of exhaustion and awe. "You and that cat," she muttered. "You just cracked a 20-year-old case." The note's author was Sarah Monroe, Grayson confirmed later. Handwriting analysis matched old letters from Lila's file. Sarah had known, or suspected, Eddie Ray's guilt, but couldn't prove it. She'd left the box and the wall confession, too broken to fight, hoping someone, someday, would find them. Shadow had been Lila's kitten, barely a year old when she vanished. How he'd survived 2 decades, haunting the basement, was a mystery no vet could explain. "He's a fighter," Emily said, stroking his patchy fur. "He had a promise to keep." The next week was a blur. Forensic teams scoured the trailer park, finding traces of Lila's DNA, but no body. Eddie Ray had covered his tracks too well. The town buzzed with the news, old wounds reopening. Mrs. Carter brought Shadow a can of fancy tuna, tears in her eyes. "He's a hero, Doc." Jake Hensley patched the basement wall, muttering about ghosts. Emily kept the locket, its photo of Lila now framed on her clinic wall, a reminder of the little girl who'd finally been heard. Shadow changed after that night. The meowing stopped. He'd sit by the clinic window, basking in the sun, his eyes half closed, peaceful. Emily adopted him officially, though she knew he'd chosen her long before. One evening, as spring crept into Maplewood, she sat with him on her porch, the air sweet with blooming lilacs. "You did it, Bud," she said softly. "You brought her home." The case closed with no arrest. Eddie Ray was long gone, likely dead. But it wasn't about justice anymore. It was about memory. Lila's story lived again in Maplewood's whispers, her smile preserved in that blurry photo. Sarah, tracked down in Springfield, came to see Shadow. She was older now, frail, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak, just knelt and pressed her forehead to his, tears falling silently. Emily watched, throat tight, knowing some wounds never heal but can still soften. Months later, on a quiet Sunday, Emily took Shadow to the cornfields behind town. She scattered wildflower seeds where Lila might have played, a small tribute. Shadow ambled beside her, slower now, his bones showing through his fur. She sat with him as the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold. "What's it all mean, huh?" she asked, half to him, half to herself. "All that waiting, all that pain." He looked up, eyes glinting, and purred, a sound not of grief but of release. Emily thought about it long after. How love lingers, how the smallest creatures carry the biggest burdens. Shadow hadn't just guarded a secret. He'd guarded a bond, a promise that even death couldn't break. Maybe that's what life was, holding on until someone listens, until the silence fills with meaning. Shadow passed that winter, curled on her couch, his breath slowing as snow fell outside. Emily buried him under the lilacs, the locket beside him. She didn't cry. She smiled, knowing he was free. The next spring, a tabby kitten appeared at the clinic, meowing softly. Emily laughed, scooping it up. "All right, universe," she said, "I'm listening." And somewhere, she swore, Lila was smiling too.